Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into Bruce H. Lipton's revolutionary research. And let me tell you, it challenges absolutely everything we thought we knew about human biology and genetic destiny. For decades, we've all been taught this very rigid, specific narrative about how our bodies work, and more importantly, who is actually in charge of our health. Well, we are going to unpack a profound shift in scientific understanding today, one that moves the power away from your microscopic DNA and places it squarely in your own hands. By the time we're done here, you might never look at a cold, a bad mood, or your family tree the exact same way again. Now, this text outlines a massive paradigm shift away from the accepted dogma that DNA dictates the course of our lives. And it's really important to understand exactly who is making these claims. Dr. Bruce Lipton wasn't just some fringe theorist. He was a deeply entrenched medical school professor and cell biologist. He spent years looking through electron microscopes, studying the very foundations of life as a tenured academic. But what he discovered behind that lens forced him to completely abandon the traditional biology he'd been teaching for years. What we're exploring today fundamentally rewrites the rules of life. We really need to start by asking a profound question. Are we merely biochemical robots waiting for a genetic time bomb to go off, or do we have actual control over our biology? Think about it for a second. How many times have you heard someone say, "Oh, it runs in my family," whether they're talking about heart disease, cancer, or even just a tendency to be in a bad mood? We've been deeply conditioned to believe that we're victims of our heredity, basically held hostage by the genetic lottery. But what if that perspective is completely backwards? Let's dig into that with Section 1, the myth of genetic determinism. To truly grasp these concepts, you're going to need to temporarily suspend what you learned in high school biology and just approach this with a completely open mind. We are deconstructing a myth that has dominated science for over half a century. The old Darwinian belief, which is often called the central dogma of molecular biology, dictates that DNA is the master blueprint. It's this top-down model where your DNA predetermines your physical traits, your emotions, and your behaviors. It's a one-way street. But the new biology flips this upside down. It proves that it's actually our environment, and crucially, our perception of that environment, that controls our genes. Ever since Watson and Crick famously discovered the DNA double helix back in 1953, society has been completely paralyzed by genetic determinism. The media went into an absolute frenzy. Tabloids heralded the secret of life, and honestly, we all just jumped on the bandwagon. We started blaming everything from a terminal illness to a bad day at work on a missing or mutant gene. We adopted this incredibly disempowering belief that if you were born with a defective gene, you were just fated to suffer the consequences. It totally stripped us of our agency. But as Dr. Lipton's research reveals, this deterministic view isn't just oppressing, it is scientifically flawed. Which brings us to Section 2, a paradigm-shattering epiphany. Let's take a quick trip to a remote island in the Caribbean, because this is where Dr. Lipton experienced his massive scientific revelation. After resigning his prestigious position at the University of Wisconsin, he found himself teaching at an offshore medical college. Far away from the rigid echo chambers of traditional academia, he finally had the mental space to think outside the box. While reviewing his extensive research on cloned stem cells, a fundamental flaw in traditional biology suddenly hit him. Genes aren't self-emergent. They cannot trigger their own activity. Let me repeat that because it literally changes everything. A gene cannot turn itself on or off. Believing that genes control biology is like believing that a paper blueprint can build a house all by itself. Something else has to trigger the activity. So the crucial point here is that genes are just molecular blueprints. A pile of blueprints sitting on the desk does absolutely nothing until a contractor comes along, reads them, and decides what to build and when. Well, in our biology, it's actually the environment that serves as the contractor. It's the cell's awareness of its environment that sets the mechanisms of life into motion. The environment decides which blueprints to pull from the genetic filing cabinet. If the environment is healthy and supportive, the cell thrives and builds healthy tissue. If it's toxic, the cell pulls the blueprints for defense and ultimately falters. The DNA is just the raw, inert data. The environment makes all the executive decisions. And this brings us right to the foundation of epigenetics, which literally translates to control above the genes. It's hands down one of the most exciting areas of scientific research today because it proves that our perceptions and our environment physically remodel our biology. Think of it this way. You could have the exact same underlying genetic code, but if you introduce chronic stress, the environment of your body becomes flooded with cortisol. That environmental signal reaches the cell and actually changes how the genetic code is read, shutting down the immune system to conserve energy for a fight or flight response. Your DNA didn't change at all, but the expression of it did. Your genes aren't locked in stone at birth. They're constantly actively being remodeled in response to your life experiences.
Let's dive deeper with Section 3, Cells as Miniature Humans.
To truly understand how this epigenetic magic works, we need to completely shift our perspective. You look in the mirror and you see one single solid person, right? But from a biological standpoint, you are actually a massive, bustling, cooperative metropolis made up of 50 trillion individual cells. And the citizens of that metropolis are infinitely smarter than we ever gave them credit for. Dr. Lipton uses a really relatable concept called cytopomorphism, cyto meaning cell, and morphism meaning human characteristics. He shows how these smart cells contain miniature organs, called organelles, that function exactly like our human systems. Every single function you have in your macroscopic body, a digestive system, a respiratory system, an excretory system, even a primitive nervous and immune system, already exist within every single microscopic cell. These aren't mindless building blocks. They actively seek out healthy environments, flee from toxic ones, learn, adapt, and communicate with each other constantly.
Now let's explore Section 4, Evolution through Cooperation.
This advanced cellular intelligence completely upends the traditional, frankly, violent view of evolution that most of us were taught. We've been programmed to view nature as an endless battlefield. Darwin gave us the concept of a random, bloody struggle for survival, nature red in tooth and claw, where the strongest kill the weakest. But 50 years before Darwin, a scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed a very different idea. Lamarck correctly suggested that evolution is actually based on a cooperative, instructive interaction among organisms and their dynamic environment. He believed organisms acquire adaptations based on what they actually need to survive, and then pass those on. Now, for centuries, Lamarck was ridiculed, but modern cell biology is proving that he was actually onto something profound.
To see Lamarck's cooperative evolution in action, let's look at how an immune cell actually learns from a threat, like a measles virus. It doesn't just rely on random Darwinian chance. The cell acts like a master locksmith, facing a complex, changing lock. First, it randomly recombines DNA to cut a bunch of different protein keys. Then, through a process called affinity maturation, the cell meticulously files and adjusts the shape of that key until it perfectly matches the viral lock. It is physically sculpting a defense. Through somatic hypermutation, it rapidly mutates its own genes to ensure a perfect fit to neutralize the virus. And here is the truly amazing part. It remembers. It passes this newly sculptured, custom-built master key down to its daughter cells. This isn't random mutation, folks. This is highly intelligent, targeted, cooperative adaptation.
And this incredible sharing of genetic information doesn't just happen within one body. It extends across entirely different species. This heavily supports the Gaia hypothesis, which suggests that the Earth and all its life forms constitute one interactive, cooperative superorganism. Down at the microscopic level, bacteria and organisms actually share genes with one another to ensure the mutual survival of the entire biosphere. And this scales all the way up to the human experience. Evolution isn't just about the dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest, most ruthless individual. It's about the survival of the fittest, most cooperative groups. We are all deeply, fundamentally interconnected.
Which perfectly sets up our final chapter, Section 5, It's the Environment, Stupid.
This brings us to the climax of our explainer, rooted in a brilliant piece of wisdom Dr. Lipton learned on his very first day cloning stem cells way back in 1967 from his mentor, Irv Königsberg. If you have a petri dish of cells, and those cells start getting sick and dying, you don't give the cells a microscopic pill. You don't blame the cell's genetics. You look at the fluid they're living in. You change the environment. If you put a healthy cell in a toxic culture medium, it gets sick. Apply this to humans and you realize that popping a drug every time we feel sick is fundamentally flawed, because it totally ignores the environmental signals controlling our biology. For us, our blood is our culture medium, and the brain is the chemist that controls the makeup of that blood based entirely on how we perceive our environment.
The new biology tells us that we are not powerless biochemical machines. Our minds are the ultimate contractors, reading those genetic blueprints. Our positive and negative beliefs are what ultimately govern our health. Let's really slow down and think about this. When you hold positive, loving thoughts, your brain acts as a chemist, releasing chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin into your blood, your culture medium, which fosters cellular growth, health, and vitality. But when you hold on to negative beliefs or live in a state of constant fear and stress, your brain releases stress hormones like cortisol and noradrenaline. Those chemicals literally shut down your cell's growth and suppress your immune mechanisms. Your beliefs literalize as your biology.
As the renowned scientist H.F. Nishaud powerfully summarized, the idea of genetic control is just a tired, outdated metaphor. The DNA is just a passive database of possibilities. It is the environment, and your perception of it, that selects which genes are turned on and which are turned off. To borrow a cheeky phrase from political campaigns, it's the environment, stupid.
I want to leave you with this final empowering thought. How will you reshape your own life now that you hold the undeniable power of your biology in your own hands? You are not a victim of your genes. You're not bound by your family history. You are the master of your fate, fully capable of creating a cellular environment overflowing with peace, happiness, and vibrant health. The power of consciousness isn't just wishful thinking. It's real, it's scientifically proven, and it's entirely yours to command. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this knowledge empowers you to look at your mind, your body, and your limitless potential in a completely new way.